Okay, let's get into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the history of Timor-Leste.
Right?
It's one of the world's youngest nations, actually, a country really forged in struggle, centuries of colonial rule, then this incredibly brutal fight for independence.
Really is an intense story, and it's located, for those maybe not quite sure, on the eastern half of Timor Island, Southeast Asia, just north of Australia there.
Exactly. And our mission today, looking at these very sources we've gathered, articles, historical accounts, different viewpoints, is to really unpack that.
Yeah, to pull out the key insights.
Yeah.
How did this nation come to be? And maybe more importantly, what are the challenges it's still facing today? Because they are significant.
Absolutely. It's definitely not a straightforward story. So maybe let's start with the basics, setting the scene. Geographically, tell us a bit more about Timor-Leste itself, the land.
Sure. So, eastern half of Timor Island, maritime Southeast Asia. You got Australia south across the Timor Sea, then the Arafura and Savu Seas north, and it includes a Toro Island nearby. What's really interesting geographically is its position near the Wallace Line.
Ah, right. The biological divide.
Exactly. And it's not just about animals and plants. It highlights this unique ecological spot, distinct from nearby Indonesia. Some sources argue this distinction kind of set the stage for a separate identity way back.
That's a fascinating point. It wasn't just destined to be part of the archipelago next door. And the terrain itself sounds pretty rugged.
Oh, very. Dominated by mountains, really. Mount Tatamalau, Mount Day-to-Day, high peaks. The sources mention like 4 distinct regions, the mountains, then salt marshes, coastal mountains, lowlands.
And agriculture is key, obviously.
Vital. Concentrated in those river valleys. You see rice, maize, coffee's big in the highlands, and livestock, fishing too, of course.
And the climate, that must have a huge impact, especially on farming. Tropical, wet, and dry seasons.
Totally. Monsoon-driven. Rainfall varies wildly, from maybe 600 millimeters up to 3,500 millimeters, mostly in the wet season.
Wow, that's a huge range.
Yeah, and it makes the long dry season really tough for farmers. Plus, you sometimes get cyclones thrown into the mix.
So this land, it's been home to people for a very, very long time. Deep roots.
Incredibly deep. We're talking prehistoric sites dated back like 40,000 years.
40,000.
Yeah, and findings up to 10,000 years ago, interesting engravings in caves, possibly ritualistic, maybe small-scale farming starting around 5,000 years back.
And contact with the outside world didn't start with Europeans, right?
Correct. The sources mention Chinese traders possibly making contact as early as the 2nd century A.D.
Wow.
Yeah, finds like bronze candelabras, silver coins. It suggests this island was plugged into regional trade networks much earlier than you might think.
It's definitely not isolated, even then. And the people themselves, their background.
Well, the roots are in ancient Austronesian migrations. But
Yeah.
the key thing the sources emphasize is this rich, distinct cultural tapestry that developed before colonialism, ethnically, linguistically. More linked perhaps towards the southwestern Pacific, differing from many groups in the Indonesian archipelago. A separate identity was already forming.
Okay, so we have this long history, this unique geography and identity. Then the outsiders arrive. Colonialism, what did that look like?
Well, fast forward to the 16th century, and you get the Portuguese navigators arriving. This eventually leads to the island being split.
Ah, the dual colonial setup.
Exactly. East Timor under the Portuguese, West Timor under the Dutch.
And the Portuguese rule in the East. The sources paint a picture of it being, well, kind of half-hearted, not a major focus for Portugal.
That's a really crucial point. It was mostly indirect rule, limited money, limited people sent over. They were there for centuries, but didn't seem to give the place much importance.
So their control wasn't exactly firm?
No, described as ill-assured in some texts. Indigenous revolts kept happening right into the 20th century. They never really had a solid grip.
What about economically? What did they encourage?
Coffee. That became a big thing. Major export. And interestingly, it led to labor being brought in, which shifted the demographics in some areas.
And things like education. Pretty minimal early on.
Very minimal. Just a few primary schools, a seminary later on, 1888. It really shows how underdeveloped the colony was kept under Portuguese rule.
And how did this Portuguese presence, even if limited, interact with that existing rich culture you mentioned?
Well, it confronted this deep-rooted culture, with its own art, myths, traditions. But inevitably, imperial policies caused erosion.
Yeah.
And the sources mention brutal attacks, too. these things called despolos, basically, violent crackdowns, massacres to assert control and grab resources. Grim stuff.
Grim indeed. So centuries of this sort of distant, sometimes violent colonial rule, and then World War II crashes onto the scene. How did that change things?
Oh, it was utterly devastating. Japan invaded in 1942, part of their bigger push for resources in Southeast Asia. This kicked off the Battle of Timor Allies versus Japanese. But what's really important, stressed in the sources, is the role of the Timorese people themselves.
They fought back?
Fiercely. They sided with the Allies, gave crucial help, intelligence, fighting against the Japanese occupiers. They weren't passive victims.
But the price they paid was enormous.
Horrific. Some estimates say maybe 30% of the entire population died between 1942 and 1950.
30%? That's staggering.
It's almost unimaginable. A level of trauma that sadly would echo later.
And it's interesting reading the sources how even back then Timor-Leste fate seemed tangled up with bigger international games.
Absolutely. There's this disturbing note about Australian negotiations with Japan after the war, maybe holding clues relevant to the 1975 Indonesian invasion.
Like prior knowledge.
It hints at it. And then in 46, as the Allies are figuring out decolonization, the U.S. isolating Portugal in NATO, that might have indirectly weakened Portugal's hold, maybe cut funding.
So the big powers were already shaping things, even if unintentionally.
Yeah, the sources suggest these complex international factors were amplifying Timor-Leste vulnerability long before the Indonesian invasion. It wasn't just about Portugal.
That definitely adds another layer. So after the war, Portugal hangs on for a while longer. What eventually sparked the move towards independence?
The big catalyst was Portugal's Carnation Revolution in April 1974. This shift to democracy in Lisbon meant a sudden decision: end colonial rule.
Which created a power vacuum in East Timor, right, almost overnight.
Exactly. And into that space, different political groups rushed in.
Factions started forming.
Very quickly. You had Fredolin described as revolutionary, Marxist-leaning, and it gained a lot of popularity, especially out in the rural areas.
Why do you think it resonated so much there, specifically, after all those years of indirect rule?
That's a great question. The sources don't fully spell out the why, but they emphasize its grassroots support. Maybe it spoke more directly to people outside the colonial structures. Then you had UDT, seen as less radical, maybe closer to the old guard.
So different visions for the future.
And this competition between them escalated fast, especially after Fredolin reportedly won a majority in constituent assembly elections. It tipped over into civil war.
Civil war. And at the same time, Indonesia was watching closely.
More than watching. The sources say the Indonesian military was already plotting an invasion, and UDT ended up aligning with Jakarta.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this internal conflict, plus UDT's alignment, just created chaos. Attacks on Portuguese, on certain Timorese groups, UDT calling for protection, but setting ambushes. It just fueled the fire and confusion.
A really volatile mix. Which leads us straight into the darkest chapter, the Indonesian invasion and that long, brutal occupation, 1975 to 99.
Yes. December 7th, 1975, the invasion begins. One source even makes the claim, quite disturbingly, that Australia facilitated it.
Facilitated it. That's a strong claim, highlighting those complex regional politics again.
It certainly does. And the invasion itself was incredibly quick.
Yeah, the sources say conquered in just 24 hours.
That's the report. Then, July 1976, Indonesia just unilaterally declares it their 27th province. There was a later UN-negotiated integration treaty, but many saw that as just rubber stamping the reality.
And the occupation itself, what was it like on the ground?
Aggressive. Repressive. Policies designed to solidify control, bringing in Indonesian migrants, military taking over land, cracking down hard on any opposition.
And Fredolin, they didn't just disappear.
No, they shifted to guerrilla warfare from the mountains. The sources mentioned they used landmines as part of their resistance.
The human rights abuses during this time, the sources are just chillin'.
They were horrific. Gross, systematic violations. We're talking destruction of infrastructure, terror campaigns, forced deportations, ethnic cleansing, targeted killings, torture, sexual violence, mass graves found later at places like Biara, Gleno, Lakisa, Swai.
The scale of the killing, it's hard to comprehend.
It really is. The exact numbers are disputed, but estimates are devastating. Maybe over 15,000 deaths per month in the early years, between 75 and 85.
A month.
That's what some sources suggest, leading to hundreds of thousands dead over the whole occupation, plus maybe 100,000 refugees fleeing. It was carnage on an unimaginable scale for such a small place.
And for so much of this period, the world just looked away.
That's another really critical point. Timor-Leste was basically sealed off, isolated internationally before 75, and then during the occupation, despite the horrors, it didn't get effective international help.
Why not?
Complex reasons. Geopolitics, Cold War dynamics, many countries valuing their relationship with Indonesia more than intervening. Regional stability, quote unquote.
So what finally broke that silence? How did the world start paying attention?
The big turning point, really, was the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991.
In Dili.
Yes. Peaceful pro-independence demonstrators were gunned down by Indonesian troops.
And this time it got out.
It did. It was filmed, photographed, it shocked the world, and finally sparked widespread international outrage and demands for human rights. NGOs were crucial then, too, organizing conferences, building a solidarity movement.
And that global pressure, combined with the Timorese resistance, started getting recognized.
Absolutely. The Nobel Peace Prize in 1996 was huge, awarded to José Ramos Horta, the key diplomatic voice abroad, and Bishop Carlos Bello, the spiritual leader inside Timor-Leste, who spoke out so bravely.
Right. Their courage was undeniable.
It really was. And the sources note that while the end of the Cold War around '89 started shifting things slightly, real international pressure only ramped up towards the very end, near 1999. Took a long time.
A painfully long time. Which brings us, finally, to the referendum, the chance for people to choose. How did that come about?
Well, several things aligned. The Suharto regime fell in Indonesia in '98, which softened their stance a bit. International pressure was mounting. The UN stepped in, brokering talks between Portugal and Indonesia, and crucially, organizing the vote itself.
So the day finally came, August 30th, 1999.
Yes. A referendum on self-determination, on independence, and the result was just overwhelming.
What was the percentage?
78% voted for independence, a massive, undeniable statement.
You'd think that would be the end of the violence.
Tragically, no. The opposite happened immediately after the vote. Pro-Indonesian militias, backed and armed by the Indonesian military, unleashed absolute hell.
Retaliation.
A coordinated campaign of violence, destruction. Sources call it a bloody bath. Mass killings, forcing people from their homes, systematically destroying buildings, infrastructure, scorched-to-earth tactics.
This time the world couldn't ignore it.
No. The scale of the violence finally forced international action. A UN multinational force, Interfet, led by Australia, was sent in to restore order after weeks of carnage.
And that led to the UN taking over temporarily.
Yes. The UN Transitional Administration for East Timor, UNTET, was set up in October '99. Their job was to manage the transition to full independence.
So the actual process of building the new nation started under the UN's watch.
Exactly. UNTET ran things from '99 to 2002. They held elections for a constituent assembly in 2001, and then in April 2002, Zena Gusmão, the resistance leader, was elected president.
And the official Independence Day?
May 20th, 2002. That's when the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste was born. Initially called Timor-Leste, Timor Sun Rising. A powerful image.
A very powerful image. And it quickly joined the world stage.
Yep, became the 191st UN member that September. A hard-won place at the table.
So, independence achieved. What were those first few years like, Galleons-wise?
Well, Zena Gusmão became prime minister, too. Initially, they pursued sort of neoliberal economic policies. But the sources make it clear the early challenges were immense.
I can only imagine. Starting from less than zero in many ways, what kind of challenges?
All sorts. Disputes over how oil money was shared, difficulties actually implementing government projects, worries about outside influence, public frustration bubbling up.
What's the basics? Jobs, crime.
Big time. High youth unemployment, crime rates, tensions between different state institutions. It actually boiled over into serious violence in 2006.
Really? What happened?
Instability within the police force triggered riots, displacement. It really shook the foundations of the new state.
Right.
Showed just how fragile things still were.
It underscores that independence wasn't the finish line, just a different starting line. But through all this turbulence, that Timorese culture remained strong, right?
Incredibly resilient. It's this amazing mix of the ancient indigenous traditions and the Portuguese influence. Traditional arts are alive, painting, carving, amazing handmade crafts like baskets.
Yeah, music.
Hugely diverse. Different styles across the regions passed down orally, lots of strings, woodwinds, percussion. Drumming's become really popular lately, the sources say.
And taias, the traditional weaving.
Yes, that's seen a real revival since independence. New designs, contemporary uses. It's become a really powerful symbol of identity and cultural pride.
And the oral traditions, stories, myths.
Still very important. Legends, folklore, even jokes and riddles passed down, sometimes performed as skits. It keeps that connection alive.
The sources also mention some specific rituals.
Like the Tayudo ceremony, this idea of destruction and creation, duality, ending in a community feast. Used in funerals, too, apparently, to kind of reset social bonds and cleanse spirits. And elaborate death rituals, generally, reflecting complex social and spiritual beliefs.
So while they're building the state, the economy, there's also this ongoing need to deal with the social scars of the occupation.
Absolutely. So many unresolved issues. Remember, during the occupation, community groups, political parties, they couldn't operate freely. It was a siege state.
Right.
So after 91, when activists could speak more, they started linking social problems directly to the need for political reform.
And the UN's initial focus under UNTATE, was it on that deeper healing?
Understandably, their first priority was just security, basic needs, food, shelter. Later, there was more attention to trauma, reconciliation, but maybe indirectly. Plus, you had this whole issue of what to do with former fighters, integrating them back into civilian life. A huge task.
Let's shift to the economy then. What did it look like at independence, and what's the main driver now?
At independence, extremely basic. Fragile, underdeveloped, means of production largely state-controlled. The GNI figures from the early years show how small and shaky it was.
But there's always this one big resource looming large.
Oil and gas, absolutely central, located in the Timor Sea. And this connects back to that controversial Timor Gap Treaty with Australia from 1972.
Controversial how?
Well, it allowed oil drilling in disputed waters. But crucially, no Timorese representative signed it. So when Timor-Leste became independent, they said, nope, that treaty's void. This led to big disputes over the maritime boundary and who got the revenue from huge fields like Wild River, which hadn't benefited the Timorese people before.
So oil became the bedrock of the new state's finances.
Hugely reliant on it. For years, it was basically the only source of government income. Funded everything, health, education, roads. The initial projections were massive. Some thought it could make Timor-Leste one of the richest countries per capita very quickly.
But that kind of wealth brings its own problems, doesn't it? The resource curse.
Exactly what the sources point to. It's a classic challenge. While oil promised riches, it also opened the door to potential corruption, mismanagement. There were questions about transparency, where early revenues went, reports of officials maybe enriching themselves.
That creates real risks for stability down the line.
Huge risks. If the wealth doesn't clearly benefit the wider population, it breeds resentment, instability.
So what's the plan to avoid that? What's the economic vision now?
They have a strategic development plan looking out to 2030. The goal is clear. Move beyond poverty, become a middle-income nation. They're trying to attract investment, national and international, into other areas.
Like what?
Agriculture, tourism, light industry, services, anything to create jobs and, crucially, diversify the economy away from just oil and gas. That dependence is risky long-term.
But for now, the state still heavily relies on the energy sector.
Yes, in the short term, the state basically controls the oil and gas revenue and decides how it's spent through state companies. There's also push for jobs in things like farming, food processing, sanitation, trying to rebuild basic subsistence agriculture, too, which was wrecked during the occupation, training programs, grants, that sort of thing.
Okay, finally, let's look at Timor-Leste's place in the world today. How is it seen internationally after such a unique and violent path to statehood?
It really is seen as a unique case. A nation accepted onto the world stage after enduring incredible brutality and emerging from 25 years of being essentially unrecognized internationally. Some even called it a quasi-state early on.
Meaning?
Meaning it had the institutions, but the actual power and autonomy were heavily constrained by outside pressures, especially at the beginning.
But since 2002, they've been actively engaging.
Definitely. A big diplomatic push right from the start, building relationships in good faith, especially with the UN and neighbors in the region. Getting that UN membership, led by Guzman, was a top priority.
And regional ties are key.
Vital. They see Australia, Indonesia, and Portugal as key strategic partners, pillars of support. And joining ASEAN and the Southeast Asian bloc is a major goal. Shows they want to be integrated and seen as a stable regional player.
And beyond the immediate region.
They're seeking support globally, trying to get involved in international organizations, building up their own diplomatic service, setting up offices for bodies like the UN Development Program, European Union Development Arms, connecting to global networks.
So they've made incredible strides, achieved independence, engaging internationally. But the underlying challenges haven't disappeared.
Not at all. They remain immense. Security is still a concern. The trauma is very fresh. Political stability is fragile. It's still a divided society in many ways, as those crises showed.
And building the capacity to govern effectively.
That's a massive hurdle. Training people, building institutions, dealing with inexperienced officials, skills gaps in the workforce, lack of basic infrastructure. It all takes time and resources.
Plus the economic challenge moving beyond oil.
Absolutely, and just overcoming the sheer weight of history, the legacy of conflict, occupation. Healing those deep wounds is a generational task.
The sources really drive home the scale of the task by mentioning human development indicators.
Yeah, they still lag way behind regional neighbors. It really highlights the enormous, urgent challenge Timor-Leste faces as it tries to build a better future in the 21st century.
So we've traced this incredible, often harrowing journey: ancient roots, colonial division, brutal occupations, civil war, and finally independence won at immense cost.
It's truly a story of unbelievable resilience. Independence was a monumental victory. But as these sources show, it wasn't an endpoint. It was the start of a new, incredibly complex struggle, building a nation from the ashes in a society deeply scarred by its past.
Timor-Leste really does stand out, a unique case in how states are formed, how societies recover from conflict, the complexities of international help. It's quite something.
So, thinking about all this, the depth of the trauma, the massive task of building everything from scratch, what lessons from that history are most crucial for Timor-Leste to hold on to as it looks ahead? Or does it need to remember, or perhaps move beyond to secure its future? That's something to really ponder.